Welcome everyone to this webinar from Routledge. Today we are discussing, does punishment change behaviour? My name is Neil Boone and I'll be moderating the webinar today. I see from the attendee list that you are a global audience, so thank you for taking the time to join us. It is much appreciated. Mainly, this is an excellent opportunity to hear from three leading authors in this important field. In terms of running order, we will have short presentations from our three panelists. Edward J. Latessa is Professor and Director of the School of Criminal Justice at the University of Cincinnati. He and his staff have assessed more than 600 correctional programs throughout the United States. Deborah Koetzle is Associate Professor in the Department of Public Management and the Executive Officer of the Criminal Justice Doctoral Program at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Her research interests center on effective interventions for offenders, problem-solving courts, and the use of social media by police departments. Kimberley D. Dodson is Associate Professor and Graduate Coordinator in the School of Law Enforcement and Justice Administration at Western Illinois University. Her research interests include using evidence-based assessments to evaluate correctional programs and policies, the effectiveness of rehabilitation and treatment for minorities, and promoting thoughtful pedagogical practices in criminal justice. Together, they will cover the following topics today: the history of punishment, why we have criminal sanctions and what is known about their effectiveness in changing behaviour, the disparity in punishment and its unintended consequences, and the need for treatment and efforts towards reducing recidivism. Following their presentations, we will then take some questions from you. And finally, I will ask the panelists for their concluding thoughts. Audience questions can be typed and sent from the questions box in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And we will put as many of these to the panelists as time allows. But please do bear in mind that we may not be able to answer all of these today. If your question is addressed to a specific panelist, please include that when you submit your question. Our panelists have kindly made their slides freely available to all attendees, and these can be downloaded during the webinar today from the control panel. I am now going to hand over to Professor Latessa for our first presentation.
Thank you, Neil. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of the history of punishment over the years, particularly as it's evolved in the United States. We need to understand that prior to the 19th century, prisons and jails were really just designed as places to detain offenders while they awaited real punishment. Things like public flogging, branding, banishment, disfigurement, or even execution was common. We really didn't have the large, massive prisons and jails that we see today. Over the years, as society began to come to the realization that these punishments were brutal, as society developed, we saw a shift during what we call the Enlightenment period, and essentially the penitentiary was born. Following the penitentiary, we saw reformatories develop, which were for younger offenders. But for all intents and purposes, the major form of punishment in the United States was incarceration. After all, we were a relatively new country, and what better way to punish people than to take away their freedom? I've included a few photos here of some of the early forms of punishment that were used. Here we can see, for example, the stocks where someone would be.
Hi, Ed. Sorry to interrupt, Ed. Would you mind just putting your slides into slideshow mode, and then they'll be full screen? That's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We can see the slides here of some of the torture devices that were used. prior really to the development of the prison. Banishment or exile was used primarily in other countries. Of course, the British were famous for using Australia and the state of Georgia. But here in the United States, again, early on, people that committed crime were banished from their community, which essentially was a death sentence for many. We also saw the use of ships, decommissioned ships. We saw the development of fortress prisons, as I mentioned, reformatories, and today many large campus-like prisons. And so this is a picture of a hulk. We might think that this is something that from a bygone era, but as late as the 1970s, the state of Washington used a decommissioned military ship to hold prisoners. Of course, everyone's familiar with Alcatraz as one of the first really supermax prisons. This is a picture of the Ohio Reformatory. We can see the Gothic-like walls that were built for this facility. I believe this was built in the 1870s and still used today. Other forms of punishment, even within the prison, can include things like solitary confinement. This is a major issue today. Many states are starting to re-examine their use of solitary and are starting to develop programs where men, and particularly men, although men and women are involved in solitary confinement, can be moved out of these conditions. Chain gangs, and of course the ultimate punishment, the death penalty. Here we see an example of a sweatbox, solitary confinement, where even in these situations, inmates learn how to communicate with each other. Chain gangs, again, we like to think of these as something from long ago, but we have more modern versions as well. Again, as late as the 1980s, some states like Alabama were using chain gangs. And we also see, of course, people working, inmates working out in areas. The death penalty, the electric chair, which was at the time seen as a more merciful way to execute offenders. The gas chamber, which was used by several states. This is a picture of the gas chamber in, I believe, California. And today, most states have gone to lethal injection. Of course, all have the same results, just seen as more humane ways to put people to death. Punishment hasn't just been confined to institutions. In the 1980s, as the crime rates grew, we became tougher on crime, we saw new forms of criminal sanctions in the community. These were often called punishing smarter, included things like boot camps, shock incarceration, where offenders would be sent to prison or jail for a short period of time, intensive supervision, where we ratcheted up what's traditional probation. The most extreme version was in the state of Georgia, where 2 officers were assigned to 10 offenders. They did unannounced visits, sometimes in the middle of the night, to make sure the offenders were where they were supposed to be. And of course, with juveniles, we've seen programs such as Scared Straight. The question, of course, is punishment effective? Some would argue that offenders deserve what they get, particularly those that argue for the death penalty. But if we define punishment, the outcome of punishment is reducing recidivism, then the answer is clearly no. A number of researchers have looked at the effects of punishment alone. And these are reviews of various studies, whether they be simply custody, mandatory arrest, increased surveillance. None of those reviews have found consistent evidence of reduced recidivism. This doesn't mean that we're not going to punish. This doesn't mean that some people don't respond to punishment. It doesn't mean you can't even find a study that supports it. But when we look at the body of that research, we don't see any consistent evidence that we're very effective in changing behavior just by punishing offenders. The good news is that 40 to 60% of studies of correctional treatment services report reduced recidivism rates in comparison conditions. Now that's good news. 40, 60% of the studies show reduced recidivism. Of course, it's also bad news. 40 to 60% of studies don't show effects. But we have to understand not all programs are equally effective. And my colleague, Dr. Koetzle, is going to talk more about that in a few minutes here. When we look at the data, and this is a result from a meta-analysis that was conducted by Don Andrews and his colleagues, looking at multiple studies, we see that on average, treatment has a modest effect, but that sanctions alone actually produce a slightly negative effect. We actually get slightly higher recidivism rates just from punishment. Of course, when we look more closely at the individual level, what we see from research is that there are people who appear to be resistant to punishment. This includes psychopathic risk takers, those under the influence of a substance, and those with a history of being punished. Unfortunately, these are often the characteristics of people that are in the correctional system. Punishment seems to work least with the people we want it to work most for. That is, many people, especially low-risk people, will respond to criminal sanctions. We don't want to lose our freedom. We don't want to lose our jobs. We don't want to lose our families' respect. But many of the people that are deeply entrenched in the criminal justice system, they appear to be immune to punishment. Fortunately, the research shows that we can reduce recidivism. And I think it's important for us to understand that within the context of the correctional system, we're not talking about treatment in isolation. We're talking about treatment with punishment. We can do programs in prison that help reduce recidivism. We can design effective community-based programs that can reduce recidivism. We also have to remember these individuals are under correctional sanction, be it probation or parole, or placed in a halfway house, or in fact incarcerated. The key is providing evidence-based programs that are appropriately designed and appropriately implemented. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague to talk a little bit more about this topic.
Many thanks, Ed. That was great. If you've got any questions for Ed, then please do send them through using the questions box in the control panel. And I'll now hand over to Professor Deborah Koetzle. Let me just bear with us a second.
All right.
Hi, Debbie, we can see you.
And there you are. All right. Good morning, or afternoon, I guess. So I want to follow up a little bit on what Dr. Latessa was talking about in terms of effective treatment. We know that, sorry, let me just get my screen arranged. You know, as he said, we know that treatment in combination with supervision can have an effect, that we can actually reduce recidivism by adding treatment onto punishment. But we also know, as he showed you, that the average effect is about 15%, which isn't very substantial. Certainly better than nothing, but we can do better. And what the research tells us is that programs that adhere to the principles of effective intervention, that is the principles of risk, need, and responsivity, can do much better than this 15% average. And so I want to talk a little bit about each of these principles. What is it that our programs should be doing, whether in prison or in the community, to increase their likelihood of success? And there we go. Oops. All right, so the first principle is the risk principle, and that really tells us who we need to target. The risk principle says that we need to match the level of service with the level of risk. This means we need to reserve our most intensive services, our most intensive treatment for our higher risk individuals, those that are at an increased likelihood of getting into trouble again. And in contrast, we don't need to do a whole lot with those that aren't at risk of getting into trouble or have a minimal risk of reoffending. But the reality is there's a tendency, I think, to really provide a lot of services to those that are low risk. They tend to be easier to work with. You feel like you can really make a difference, and so we kind of focus our energies on those. The research, though, shows us that providing a lot of service to low-risk individuals can actually increase recidivism. And if we think about low-risk people, they're actually pretty successful in life, or relatively. They usually have jobs, they might be going to school, they have, you know, positive friends, positive family relationships, and we can disrupt all of that when we put them into intensive programming, on intensive supervision, or incarcerate them. It takes away all of those positives that are in place. It might increase feelings of unfairness or rebellion. They might perceive the punishment to be unjust. And at the same time, we're introducing them to criminal others that might model and reinforce continued antisocial thinking. And all of this kind of comes together then to increase recidivism versus decreasing it. So the risk principle would tell us that we need to be really careful about who we're targeting for services. Our first step then in making sure that our programs are effective is to assess people for their risk of recidivism and then focus on those that actually need intervention. Once we've identified who we should be providing services to, we also need to make sure that we're targeting the right types of needs. And this is the criminogenic needs, or the needs principle, which tells us that we need to target those factors that actually contribute to recidivism, and that can be changed. And so these include things like substance abuse or self-control, having poor problem-solving skills, anger management issues, maybe reducing antisocial peer associates. So if you have someone who has a lot of criminal friends, how do we disrupt those friendship networks and introduce them to other positive friends? And the needs principle then would suggest that when we target these types of criminogenic needs, these factors that predict recidivism, we decrease the likelihood of recidivism, and that then should translate to actual reductions in recidivism. One of the problems, though, is that many of our programs actually target non-criminogenic needs. They target factors that aren't directly related to recidivism. Dr. Latessa mentioned boot camps back in the 1980s, and I think these are a great example of having the wrong type of target in place. You know, they target physical fitness, discipline, fear of official punishment, and what we know is that they weren't very effective. And it's because they weren't targeting the right types of factors. I think one of the challenges that we have in corrections is that many of our programs are often based on feel-good premises rather than science and theory. And so we can see some recent examples. Last year, the Washington Post ran a story about prison gardens in Maryland. More recently, earlier this month, there was a story on BBC about Tim Robbins doing acting workshops in California prisons. And in both cases, these articles suggested that these programs reduce recidivism. But the reality is, there's no theoretical reason to expect this to be the case. And my suspicion is that if we were to subject these types of programs to rigorous evaluation, we would not find evidence of success. At the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge that these types of activities have a benefit, right? That it keeps people active, it can help to reduce perhaps stress and anxiety. And so it's not necessarily that we need to do away with activities in prison settings, but we need to recognize that they shouldn't be expected to reduce recidivism. And I think there's a danger in promoting this type of correctional quackery. We really need to be emphasizing programs and investing in programs and services that target empirically and theoretically relevant needs when we're talking about reducing recidivism. Once we've identified who we need to target, what we need to target, The responsivity principle tells us how we should go about targeting these needs. And so the responsivity principle essentially acknowledges that people respond differently to treatment strategies and to correctional environments. And it's a pretty broad concept, but I think the easiest way to think of it is that we need to acknowledge these barriers to success and remove them. And then in doing so, we increase the likelihood of positive outcomes. When we talk about responsivity, we can think about individual level factors. So things like motivation, personality, language, and even things like transportation. You know, in New York City, people on probation are sometimes referred to groups that are a 2-hour bus ride away. And if you're not that motivated to change behavior and you have to get on a bus for 2 hours, you might be inclined just to skip group and become non-compliant rather than following along. And so responsivity would say that we need to do better of removing these barriers. Other types of barriers would include demographics, things like gender. We know that we shouldn't put boys and girls or men and women into the same group, and things like mental health. If someone's dealing with mental illness, we want to stabilize that and make sure that they're stable before we start putting them into groups intended to change behavior. But we need to make sure that we actually put them into groups intended at changing behaviors and targeting criminogenic needs. Oops. When we talk about general responsivity, what we're really talking about is the type of treatment. And what we know is across the board that a behavioral approach to treatment is the most effective type of approach. What does this mean in practice? This means having programs that focus on current factors that influence behavior versus past historical factors. So it's what's happening in someone's life today versus what happened when they were maybe 3, 4 years old. It means that it's very action-oriented. Rather than sitting around in a circle talking about ideas, you're actually getting up and role-playing and demonstrating and practicing new types of skills and new types of thinking. And it also means that behavior is appropriately reinforced, and so that we're not just punishing, but we're also reinforcing those types of behaviors that we want to see people engage in. Some examples of effective behavioral models include structured social learning programs, where new skills, new behaviors are modeled by the facilitators, and then individuals are given opportunities to practice those. Family-based approaches like MST or FFT that seek to improve family functioning, family relationships, while reducing problem behaviors, and cognitive behavioral approaches that focus on both cognitive restructuring, so replacing antisocial thinking with pro-social thinking, and cognitive skill building, teaching problem-solving skills, refusal skills, how to be assertive, and so forth. And so the question is whether or not this all really matters. Does it make a difference? And of course the answer is yes. A meta-analysis conducted by Andrews and Dodson in '99 found that programs that adhere to all of these risk, need, and responsivity can reduce recidivism on average 36%. So more than double that earlier number that Latessa shared about the 15% average. So making sure that we're targeting high-risk people, that we're targeting criminogenic needs, that we're providing a behavioral approach can really increase the success of our programs. And when we think about the number of people under correctional supervision and the impact that that has, not just on them, but on their families and our communities, I think it's really important that our programs move in this direction. So that is all I have, and I will move on then to turn things over to Kim Dodson.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Okay, so we'll now hear from Dr. Kimberley Dodson. Just bear with us whilst we connect to Kimberley. Hi, Kim. I can see you.
Okay.
And I can hear you.
Okay. Good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about disparate punishment and the unintended consequences of punishment. So I think what I'm going to present and what I'm going to talk about really melds nicely with what Dr. Latessa and Dr. Koetzle had to say so far. And then our question is, does punishment work? So we have to look at how this is being implemented and how it's actually being executed on a broad scale. And I always think it's important for us to understand how the components of the criminal justice system work together, because policing and sentencing certainly impacts what happens in corrections and how we execute things. So I wanted to start talking about what Dr. Koetzle had mentioned just a moment ago. How does race, gender, age, how do these demographic characteristics play into how do we police individuals, how do we sentence individuals, and how do we incarcerate individuals? So I wanted to take a brief look at these factors and talk a little bit about what we know through the research. So we know, at least this is true in the United States, that minorities are more likely to be stopped when they're walking, when they're driving, when they're shopping. And we also know in the wake of the terrorist attacks from 9/11 that Muslim individuals are more likely to be detained in our airports while flying. We euphemistically refer to this as driving while black, or walking while black or brown, or flying while Muslim, or flying while Arab. So we know that when we're talking about how communities are policed, it very much depends on race, gender, and age, and other factors. One study that was released from the NYPD, they had an aggressive program of stop and frisk, and there were comparisons done in order to look at the demographics of the individuals who were stopped and frisked compared to the census population. And if you look at the chart below, we clearly see that blacks are being disproportionately detained by police, the same for Latinos, and then it falls off from there. When you look at the population comparisons, you can clearly see that minority individuals are being targeted by the police. So looking at race and gender and age further and how we decide to punish, or who we decide to punish, we know that a number of different things, that African Americans are more likely to be incarcerated, they're more likely to have higher bond amounts, they're less likely to be released on their own recognizance. So they already have kind of the cards stacked against them when they wind up in the criminal justice system. Women are more likely to receive sentencing enhancement, especially if they do something that's maybe considered outside their gender role. If they are involved in particularly drug activity, they are disproportionately likely to receive a very harsh sentence for that. And that is true when we talk about intersectionality and we talk about the disproportionate impact for women of color. As a matter of fact, African American women are the largest growing population of those being currently incarcerated in the U.S. If a woman is seen as playing a more traditional role, if she's a mother, if she's a wife, we also know through research that she's likely to receive a reduced sentence in comparison to fathers who are husbands and play roles in the family of support, but that same deference is not given to males, it's given to females, however, so their sentences are reduced. We know that older offenders are more likely than younger offenders to receive probation or to receive early release. Much of this may have to do with medical conditions and activities of daily living where they're more likely to get compassionate release or medical parole. And one of the more interesting studies that I read recently is that the public is open to considering gender and age in sentencing decisions, so they actually think these demographic factors are something that should be looked at when we're determining who to punish. But interestingly enough, they rejected the idea that we should look at race in regards to punishment. We also know that minorities are more likely to be incarcerated and less likely to receive community sanctions. So they're less likely to be sentenced to community release or receive some type of alternative punishment. We know minority women, especially black women, are more likely than white women to be incarcerated, even if they're in a similarly situated crime or criminal behavior. We know that those individuals will still receive a harsher punishment. And then we also know that minorities receive harsher punishments once they're incarcerated. So for instance, if someone is minority and they have a fight on the, out in a yard or something with other inmates, that they are going to be subject to harsher punishments even when they're behind bars. So the question becomes, just to pause and reflect on that for a moment. So the question becomes, does punishment work, or is punishment effective? When we see all of these disparities occurring, it's highly unlikely that these other factors that we're looking at are helping us to be successful in achieving deterrence or achieving a reduction in recidivism. So that kind of segues us into talking about these unintended consequences of punishment. So as Dr. Latessa was talking about earlier, in the 1990s and maybe the late 1980s, we saw Get Tough policies really take hold. There was rhetoric about super predators and individuals that were just really going to take over, and we were going to see these increasing crime waves if we didn't do something to stop it. So we saw these harsh punishments, and some of the consequences of that were like zero tolerance policies. We started transferring juveniles or waiving juveniles over to adult courts and sentencing them as adults based on the crime that they have committed, particularly if it was a serious crime like rape or robbery or homicide. Those individuals were going to be automatically waived into adult court and be tried as adults. For adults, we were seeing things like 3 strikes laws, mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing laws, where we say if we sentence somebody to 10 years, we want to make sure that they actually do 10 years, that it's not based on some type of percentage. And then we saw the elimination and the reduction of probation and parole across the United States. So with regards to juveniles, one of the things that happened with these zero tolerance policies is that we know we created a school to prison pipeline, where we created policies and practices within the schools where we were criminalizing things previously would have been thought of as something that the principal could resolve or that the teachers could resolve. Say that 2 juveniles maybe got into an argument or they got into a little shoving match. In the past, the principal would take care of that and he would separate the 2 individuals, and they would make up later or be told to apologize to each other, and that would be all. Now, under the zero tolerance policies, the police intervene. So the police frequently come to school, and things that were minor offenses before in school have now been criminalized, which has resulted in some serious problems for these populations that we've been talking about. These are the individuals who end up in the school to prison pipeline. We're talking about blacks, Hispanics, Latinos, people that are biracial. We're talking about gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered individuals. People with physical or developmental disabilities. Sometimes someone may act out as a result of a condition that they have. For instance, maybe a student has autism, and because they act out in a way because of this disorder, then that is criminalized, and the police are called and they're taken to jail. We know that undocumented youth or English second language learners are more likely to come into the school to prison pipeline. They're more likely to be targeted for punishment, and also homeless and foster children. So what is the result of that? What is the consequence of that? We have serious dropout rates in the United States. Black and Latino students are twice as likely not to graduate from high school in comparison to whites. And 68% of all males in state and federal prisons do not have a high school diploma. So we know that what we're seeing happening through the school to prison pipeline, we're seeing that play out in correctional facilities. Another unintended consequences is we have this situation where we have net widening, which I was mentioning earlier with the school to prison pipeline. Previously, what would have been thought as something that was something that the school could take care of is now requiring criminal justice intervention. So net widening has occurred, and individuals are being caught in the net and processed through the criminal justice system more frequently, particularly juveniles. We're seeing an overburdened court system. More offenders means more cases that need to be processed through the criminal justice system. As a result of these backlog of cases, though, prosecutors are under a tremendous burden to try to clear these cases and try to get rid of this backlog. So we have seen an increase in plea bargainings in courts as defendants are actually often pressured to take low and go, as we euphemistically say here. They're going to get the lower sentence if they go ahead and plead out. They'll get less time, and prosecutors maybe are less concerned with due process and ensuring individual rights rather than just clearing their caseload. So it's at the sacrifice of due process. Also, an unintended consequence of these get harsh policies and what we're doing is that we're seeing higher and higher incarceration rates. There's an excellent book out by Travis Pratt on this called Addicted to Incarceration, talking about how 3 strikes laws, mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing, all of these harsh punishments have led to us as a knee-jerk reaction just constantly using incarceration and not thinking in terms of alternative sanctions. So we're seeing higher and higher incarceration rates in the United States. We saw a dip in correctional populations, but that dip was primarily the result of people being released from probation and parole, and not really significant reductions in institutional incarceration. So what that leads us to believe is that we're not being effective in who we're punishing. There's many people that we could maybe divert out of the system that we're diverting into the system. And then I think lastly, prison overcrowding and civil liability. When we have the situation where we have crowding, this is a violation of our 8th Amendment guarantee against cruel and unusual punishment. It's considered a condition of confinement. And if we have overcrowding situations, that can be deemed cruel and unusual. So facilities are actually, the criminal justice system is opening itself up to instances of civil liability and being sued. So I included the references for your review if you're interested in that, and then I will hand this back to Neil.
Thank you very much, Kim. Okay, so well, I think we've had 3 very interesting presentations which have already thrown up a number of questions. So what I'd like to do is ask each of the panelists to share their webcams, and we'll take some questions, and we'll also give them an opportunity to discuss some of the points raised which they've heard from their colleagues today. We've received a few questions, so I'll throw some of those out there to begin with. The first one was to Dr. Latessa. So Ed, why is it that punishment seems to work for some people?
Well, I think that the general response is that punishment seems to work best for lower risk, more pro-social people. People like you. You know, if you got into some trouble, you of course are worried about your family, your job, your career. Those things are foremost in your mind, and so you're going to respond to that, probably to that sanction. Of course, you don't need much of a sanction. The mere fact that you've been, brought to court is probably sufficient that you're never going to do it again. On the other hand, if you're someone who's been in trouble most of your life, been in and out of jail, doesn't, is impulsive, doesn't see any problem with what they do, punishment alone is not going to have a whole lot of effect. I always say if you go to any jail in the United States, about 80% of the people in it on any given day have been there before. And so if it really works so well, why do they keep coming back again? And as you heard in the presentation, it's partly because we're not providing appropriate services and programs to help reduce their risk of reoffending.
Thank you, Ed. Dr. Koetzle, I had a question from the audience member Dave Thompson. He asks, are isolation and stigma criminogenic needs?
I want wouldn't say that isolation and stigma are criminogenic needs. It's not something that we want to target, but I think experiencing isolation and experiencing stigma certainly make it more difficult to be successful. Right, so if we have someone who's coming back into the community from prison, they're labeled as an ex-con, a felon, you know, they're prohibited from applying for certain types of housing, finding a job is more difficult, that all of those barriers make it much more difficult to smoothly integrate back into the community and do things in a pro-social way. And similarly, isolation, when we cut people off from others, we know that that has a number of negative effects. And so I wouldn't necessarily label them criminogenic needs in the sense that it's something that we want to do or should target. And in fact, I think that they actually make things much more challenging for people trying to change behavior.
Thank you. A question for Dr. Dodson. This is from Brian Colgan, are the arrest rates by race type in more alignment with a race reported by victims?
So, can you repeat the question? I'm not sure that I understand what he's asking.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll try again. Are the arrest rates by race type in more alignment with a race reported by victims?
So so I assume that he's asking is crime against is it, you know, interracial or intraracial? So in the United States we know that most offenses happen interracially. So you see consistency with white offenders, you know, assaulting or victimizing other white victims, or we see black offenders, you know, victimizing black victims. So we tend to see that interracially. So it seems to be consistent across races.
Okay, thank you, Kim. I have another question here, which I think I'll put to Dr. Latessa. It's from George Kane. If punishment works for lower level offenders, why are we saying we shouldn't be punishing them in the first place?
Well, when we say it works, it means that you know, the mere fact that they've been kind of charged or brought to court usually is sufficient to see that they won't do it again. What we're really saying is that low-risk people don't need a lot of programs and services to further reduce their risk. In fact, when we overload them with programs and services, we often increase their failure rates. But we also have to remember that with low-risk people, how they fail at higher rates is, one, we put them in with higher risk people. And so one of the elements of the risk principle is you don't want to put low-risk people in with high-risk people. We don't want our teenage kids hanging around with kids that get in trouble and use drugs and run in gangs, for the very simple reason that we don't want them to pick up those traits. And so one of the reasons that low-risk people get worse is we put them in with high-risk people. The other reason is because when you take low-risk people and you give them a lot of sanctions, you're disrupting what makes them low risk. You know, they have to, as Professor Koetzle said, if it takes you 2 hours to get to a group and you have to be at work and you have to miss your job, well, that disrupts what makes you low risk, right? Because you have a job and you're trying to do the right thing. So what we really say, we're not saying don't do anything with the low-risk people. We're really saying they should be held accountable, but we don't have to make them worse. And we often make them worse when we either do too much or we put them in with high-risk individuals.
Thank you. This is a question from Michael Delaney. I'll just throw it out there, and please jump in, whoever wants to answer this. Do the presenters have any insight on how to reconcile disparate risk levels among sex offenders? That is, one who is at high risk for a sexual reoffence but low risk for general criminal offences.
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, I think that that involves assessment. In the world of actuarial risk assessment, there are what we would call kind of general overall risk assessment tools. A number of these tools, like the level of service inventory, the Ohio Risk Assessment System, and others, assess a range of risk factors, those areas that have been found to be strongly correlated with recidivism, things like attitudes and who you hang around with, and substance abuse and so forth. Those tools do a good job of putting offenders into different risk categories. You know, in the area specifically with sex offenders, there are tools designed specifically to look at that particular behavior. And so, for example, the Static 99 is an example of a sex offender assessment tool that is really designed to look at the risk of sexual recidivism. Now, many sex offenders actually commit non-sex offender related offenses in recidivism studies. And what that really tells us is that they have a number of other risk factors that need to be examined and explored. Some sex offenders score very low on instruments like the LSI, for example, but may not score low on an instrument like the Static 99, in which case they're high risk for committing a sex crime, but not particularly high risk for committing other more general types of offenses. And so what we would recommend is that you really need to conduct multiple assessments. You need to look at their overall risk of reoffending, as well as use a tool that's designed specifically to examine their sexual behavior.
I think I'd like to jump in on that question as well. You know, another thing I think that we need to look at is the way that we have the laws implemented currently. We know through research that we have sex offender registries. They do absolutely nothing in terms of recidivism. They do not reduce recidivism. We know through research that sometimes when we have a reoffense, that police are actually able to apprehend somebody more quickly who may have committed that particular sex crime. So we do know in terms of being able to identify maybe sex offenders in the neighborhood, that kind of thing, we may be able to use that effectively. We put people on the sex offender registry that end up being very low level for risk for reoffending, and we stigmatize and label those individuals. So I think, you know, policymakers and researchers need to do a better job of talking to key stakeholders and doing something to change the way that the current laws are written. People are very upset and get very emotional. It's what Dr. Koetzle was saying earlier about feel-good laws that we put in place. We put these laws in place and we think that they're doing something, and the public thinks that we're, you know, really being tough on crime, and that we're taking these kinds of things seriously. But what happens is net widening. We end up catching people in the criminal justice system and processing them through who would actually probably be low-level offenders or maybe shouldn't have been labeled sex offenders in the first place. So I think that we need to do a better job in terms of connecting research with policy as well.
Thank you, Kim. A question from Raina Cartagena. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. How do we effectively address the low risk but high need offender? For example, an older offender with a substance abuse issue.
Yeah, let me take that. I think we need to understand that there are risk factors. There are risk factors that are correlated with criminal conduct. Some of these risk factors are called criminogenic needs because they're dynamic. We can target them, we can change them. Some of these criminogenic areas are not changeable. For example, having a extensive prior record. It's really nothing you can do about that other than stay out of trouble in the future. And so I think we somehow make a mistake when we start to separate risk from needs. There are needs that people have that we all have that need to be met. You know, we all have a need for housing and medical care and so forth. Everyone has those needs. And then there are risk factors. behaviors. Some are dynamic, some aren't. So just because you're an older offender doesn't make you low risk. And if you have a substance abuse problem, that's contributing to your risk of reoffending, and that you need help with that area. And I would argue that some tool, some good assessment tool, pull all that together. And so that individual, he may be low risk because he may not be a serious substance abuser. Maybe be someone who occasionally uses drugs. But the assessment would help determine that and help distinguish, help give you some idea of in fact, how much risk he was at for reoffending.
Thank you. Dr. Koetzle, did you want to add anything to that?
You know, I would just say that, and I completely agree with everything that Dr. Latessa said. There are times, as he mentioned, that we do have low-risk people who do have some need, whether it's a general functioning need like housing, or perhaps something more directly related to risk like substance abuse. And so I think, you know, we have a responsibility to help people, but at the same time, I think for low-risk people, we want to kind of stay hands-off as much as possible because of all the dangers in bringing people further into the system. You know, we start seeing non-compliance rates go up, technical violations go up, and just tend to make things worse. And so I think we just need to be careful as a system to distinguish between kind of helping efforts versus helping conditions, right? And not doing more harm under the auspices of trying to help.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. So I've got a question here for Dr. Dodson. How do sentencing disparities impact minority communities?
They impact minority communities to a great deal. Recently, I've been doing research on incarcerated mothers, and I've been looking at prison nursery programs. So I've been looking at the effectiveness of these nursery programs to see if the mothers can reconnect with their infants or their children. And what we find is that women who are incarcerated, approximately 74%, women of color, are the primary caregivers for their children when they become incarcerated. So we're talking about taking mothers out of the picture. We're talking about taking fathers out of the picture. 1 in 3 black males between the ages, you know, of 18 and 30 are incarcerated in the United States or on some kind of supervision. So with the drug sentencing laws that we've had in the United States, those have also disproportionately targeted minority communities, and the impact has been devastating. It's really shook the communities to their roots, and it's hard for these individuals to recover. They're losing mothers, they're losing fathers, they're losing the individuals that can structure their communities. And the children have very few positive role models. So it's had a devastating impact on minority communities in the United States.
Thank you, Kim. Well, I think the clock is against us, so I think now's the time we start to wrap things up. We've covered a great deal of ground today, and I'd like to end by asking each of the panelists in turn to offer a brief concluding thought. I know it's a big ask to weave together all of the conversations we've had, but perhaps if I could turn to Kim first, then Debbie, and then Ed, just to offer a brief concluding thought.
I think when we're talking about what works with regards to punishment, that Dr. Latessa and Dr. Koetzle laid out some strategies, you know, based on empirical research that would actually be much more effective than current policies and things that we're doing. We tend to use feel-good policies. We tend to use policies that are one-size-fits-all. And if you've ever worn a shirt of one-size-fits-all, you know, one size fits mostly none, right? So I think that we could be more reflective in how we're punishing. We could really be more honest and genuine about the disparities that are going on with regards to punishment and try to do things to guard against that. And I think these assessment instruments and the work that Dr. Latessa is doing in terms of, you know, what works in reducing recidivism, some of the research out of the University of Maryland that's done with Lawrence Sherman and his colleagues, also looking at this idea of, what works. We have the information. We just need to do better in bridging the gap between the researchers and the practitioners in trying to implement this. So I think that we just need to do a better job, and that punishment should be more targeted. It should be based on the offender's needs and what we can do to improve their lives. And thus, I think we would also improve the lives of people living in these communities.
Thank you. Debbie?
Yeah, I would totally agree with everything that Professor Dodson said. We have, 7 million people on supervision in this country, and it's encouraging to hear that there's more and more conversation around this issue, that we're talking about issues of mass incarceration, that we're talking about issues of disparities in both policing, sentencing, and so forth. I think, as Dr. Dodson mentioned, we really need to do a better job of minimizing this gap between research and practice. And in part, I think that events like these help with that. I think that we need to do a better job in our universities training our students on what works, both in criminal justice programs as well as social work and psychology programs. And then I think we need to make better investments in our staff and the nature of training. We can't expect this just to occur overnight. Hopefully the conversations that are occurring in the media will help move us in that, but I certainly hope that people will continue to look to the literature versus just kind of what feels or sounds like a good idea.
Thank you. And Professor Latessa?
Well, I'm optimistic. I think we're entering a new era where, at least in corrections, we have seen a reduction in prison population in the last few years. There's a renewed effort to look at what we're doing both inside and outside the walls with offenders. And I think that we're now taking a new look at how the police operate. Social justice is at the forefront. So I'm actually encouraged. I think that the next decade we're going to hopefully see some major shifts, not only in public attitudes, but in what we actually do. We're always going to need to have prisons, but I think that it's very clear that we can do a much better job of making better decisions about who needs to go in prison and how long they need to be there and what to do when they're there. So I'll end on that note, and thanks for having us here.
Thank you. Well, it remains for me to say a big thank you to our three panelists for their excellent presentation and for the insightful and lively debate. I'd also like to thank all the attendees for your great questions and for supporting us today. I really hope you've all found it an interesting and stimulating discussion. I would encourage you all to go online to routledge.com/criminology, where you will find further details about the books our panelists have written on this topic, as well as many more related titles. Thank you very much for attending today, and I really look forward to seeing you all again online soon. Thank you.